these microphones. Welcome to the July meeting of the Nottingham Lodge of the Theosophical Society. This month I'm going to do lecture 2 in our Abrahamic series. And I'd like to welcome our visitors who are with us for the first time. Lecture 1 is available on YouTube on Sally's channel. This lecture I've entitled Theosophy and the Jews. I'm dealing with the 3 Semitic religions and their relationship to Sufism, although that will culminate in the last lecture. So, the Jews. One of the things about them is that they're totally unique and remarkable for being so long-lasting, because they've been around for at least 3,000 years. And there's very few, and they're both at the same time, a people with common ancestors and a belief system. And that is quite remarkable. I'm going to begin with a little bit of chronology history session so that it begins to make sense. Set the TARDIS, and we'll go back to about 4,500 BC. That's the civilization of Susa and Kish in what they call the pre-dynastic era in Egypt. Take a jump forward to 3,600. Civilization began in Sumeria. About 100 years later, 3,500, there was the first dynasty in Egypt. 2,800 roughly, Sargon united Samaria and Arcadia, forming a major empire in what is now Iraq. We jump forward to about 2000 BC. We come to the period of the wanderings, which is about 2000 BC to 1200 BC. This is Abraham and Sarah leave Ur in Chaldea in Babylon. Time of the patriarchs wandering around in Canaan. Joseph takes the Jews to Egypt, and eventually the pharaohs enslave them. Welcome, Jean. I was just running through the basics of Old Testament history that is being recorded. We just about got to 1200 BC, which was around the time that Joseph took the Jews to Egypt and the pharaohs enslaved them according to the Bible. At the same time, Hannah Rabbi established the Babylonian Empire in Chaldea. The Egyptian Empire was extended, the Assyrians began to rise, and the Hyksos tribes invaded Egypt. Over the next 100 years or so, 12,000 to 11,000, Egyptian supremacy began to be challenged. There were civil wars and revolts in Egypt. The Bible talks about a pharaoh who knew not Joseph. That means that there was a regime change, to use the modern terms, but we don't know the details. Around this time, Moses led the Jews out of Egypt, wanderings in the Sinai desert. Ultimately, Jews entered and conquered the Canaanites in Palestine. That's phase one. Phase two is the independence period for about 300 years, from 1200 to 900, again before Christ. Up to about 1000 is the age of the judges, loose tribal confederations. Around about the year 1000, Saul becomes the first king of the Jews, and then we get the reign of King David, followed by his son Solomon, who ended up causing, or his descendants caused, the breakup of Palestine into the two kingdoms of Judah in the south and Israel in the north. Then around about 800 to 700, Israel is conquered by the Assyrians, that's the north, end of the northern kingdom. The 700 is around the time of the book of Isaiah. 700 is also the time of King Josiah, and he restored the law. What happened was you had a sequence of good kings and bad kings. And King Manasseh was a bad king, and he ended up martyring Isaiah. He was actually sawn in half, but that got taken out of the account in the Hebrew Bible, being too barbaric. After his death, Josiah, his son, found a scroll of the law buried in a wall in the temple. You can see all this in the books of the Kings and the Chronicles. 600 BC, the kingdom of Judah falls. The Jews were deported to Babylonia, destruction of Jerusalem, destruction of Solomon's temple. 6th century BC heralded the end of the Semitic empires and cultures. Now began the Indo-European civilizations. Persian domination from 500 to 300. First return of the Jews from Babylonia, the temple was rebuilt, known as the Temple of Zerubbabel. It took a period of years to build it. Second wave, Jews from Babylon under Ezra. And then finally, from 334 to 322, the Jews come under Grecian influence, known as Hellenization. First contact with the West, and the Greco-Roman period begins. That's just a bit of a timeline. Alexander the Great defeats the Persians at Granicus, becomes master of the Middle East, annexes Palestine in 322. And this is what the Jewish historian Max Diamont has to say about things. The Jews elbowed their way into history late and inconspicuously. They went through no Stone or Bronze Age. They had no Iron Age. For the first 800 years of their existence, they wandered in and out of the great civilizations surrounding them. No buildings, no cities, no armies, no weapons. All they carried with them were their ideas, which eventually conquered the world without making them its masters. Jewish history dates from the day 4,000 years ago when a man named Abraham had an encounter with God, known to him as El Shaddai, the Ancient One. The dialogue between Jew and God begins then. This continuing dialogue is the history of the Jews, with the rest of the world as interested eavesdroppers. But before we start the history of the Jews in the pagan age, during which they were passed like concubines from the Egyptians to the Assyrians to the Babylonians to the Persians and eventually to the Greeks and Romans, let's just have a look at what was happening before they came on the scene. The first signs of civilization, with all its classical symptoms, cities, agriculture, calendar, refinement of weapons, armies and taxes began cropping up around 4500 BC. History gave birth to two civilizations at the same time, both Semitic, one to the northeast of Palestine, the other to the southwest of it. It took 2,500 years before these civilizations, the Mesopotamian, which is centered around Iraq, and the Egyptian, found out about each other. After that, the fight was on, with Palestine paying the price of being the buffer state in the middle. Civilization in Mesopotamia, now Iraq, began with city-states. The oldest and most prominent were Susa, Kish, and Ur. The Bible says that Ur was where Abraham came from. It was around these cities that the first empires were formed. Just where they were located can be more easily visualized if we draw an east-west line through the middle of Iraq. The northern part became Assyria, the southern part became Babylonia. And Babylonia was also divided in half, the kingdom of Akkad and the kingdom of Sumer, the first two empire civilizations. In the 3rd millennium BC, there arose in Akkad a great Semitic king by the name of Sargon I. Now, this is where I want to switch and do a little bit of theosophy, because if you read principally in the Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky is quite scathing about parts of the Bible. She knows what the Bible says. She was brought up as a Russian Orthodox Christian. But what she goes on to say in the light of 19th century research is that she believes that a lot of the stories in the Bible were actually copies of older tales. And one of the things she talks about at some length, you can easily look it up, is that the story of Moses is actually a copy of the story of Sargon I, who in a pagan context was dedicated to the gods by being placed in a basket on the river Euphrates, and so on, so on, so on. And in fact, one of the things that is interesting is that we tend to read the Bible somewhat in isolation. It doesn't tell us much about what's going on geopolitically around it. It does a little bit at times, but it tends to focus very much on one particular familial group of people and their descendants. And this isn't actually very accurate. Some time after World War II, a guy called Pritchard wrote a whole series of volumes, translated a whole series of volumes, which are now known as the Ancient Near Eastern Texts, or ANET for short. And they've got a collection of these stories which come from the pagan nations. And they're actually quite close to the Bible quite often. There's Gilgamesh for the story of Noah, for one. Sargon, I've mentioned it. It goes on a bit. So actually, Blavatsky was right. The stories in the Bible aren't as unique as we think they are. You've got to put in the caveat that the reason why she took this line in 1888 when she wrote The Secret Doctrine was that she'd been under considerable attack for a number of years from Christian missionaries sponsored by the British Empire, whose main aim in life was to convert the Indians to a form of British Protestantism. And they deeply resented the fact that Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society were doing the direct opposite and publicizing Eastern ideas. So what happened was a bit of a tit for tat. The Theosophists began to question quite severely the Judeo-Christian view of the world. And it's no bad thing that we just take every word in the Bible as straight, absolute truth. We also know, which wasn't quite so well known in Blavatsky's time, that the Bible was put together from a number of very disparate sources. In the books of Moses alone, they recognized 4 different linguistic sources. Another thing that Blavatsky said is because of the history of the exiles in Babylon in particular, the Jews almost lost a great deal of what they had, and it was all sort of stitched together by people like Ezra, whom I've already mentioned, who led the second wave coming back to Palestine from the Babylonian exile. So jumping back to Sargon I, he conquered the Sumerians and formed the Sumerian Akkadian Empire. These people had a high standard of living, highly developed culture, and they also had a powerful tool which transformed this civilization from an agricultural economy to one of commerce and industry. This was cuneiform writing, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, distinctive of the characters the marks made in clay, which were a great improvement over the slightly cumbersome Egyptian hieroglyphics, which were pictures. It remained for the king and lawgiver named Hammurabi to unite around 2100 BC all the city-states in the area into the vast Babylonian Empire. He was the Moses of the Babylonians, giving them a code of law as a present from heaven, much as Moses was to give his code of law to the Israelites at Mount Sinai 1,000 years later. During these 2,500 years, while the people of these civilizations built cities, enriched themselves with plunder, enjoyed their mistresses, wrote their laws, drank their wine, and dreamed of world conquest, the Jews were non-existent. Then about 2000 BC, when a new and restless Semitic tribe, the Assyrians, lean and hungry, began to challenge the soft, rich lifestyle of the Babylonians, a man named Terah took his son Abraham, Abraham's wife Sarah, and his grandson Lot, the nephew of Abraham, and emigrated from the cosmopolitan city of Ur in Babylonia. Who were they? Terah, Abraham, Sarah, and Lot. Covered this a bit last week, but Max Diamond says history doesn't know, and the Bible doesn't identify them, beyond tracing Terah's genealogy to Shem, one of the 3 sons of Noah. Was Terah Babylonian? What language did he speak? What was his occupation? Certainly not a sheep herder, living as he did in one of the most sophisticated cities of the age. All these are questions that the Bible leaves unanswered. But by the act of crossing the river Euphrates, Terah and his family became the first people in the Bible identified as Ephraim, of which the English version is Hebrews. It literally means those people who crossed over, or the people from the other side. The wanderings of Terah and his small group took them 600 miles northwest from Ur to the land of Haran, in the southern part of what is now Turkey. Here, Terah had left Ur at no one's prompting dies. Here, Abraham has a strange experience. It's here that he meets the Lord, who calls himself El Shaddai, and in Moses' time becomes known as Jehovah. Diamond says it was a meeting comparable in importance with the later encounter of Paul with Christ on the road to Damascus. Abraham's experience was as portentous to the Jews as Paul's was to the Christians. At this encounter between Abraham and God, it is God who promises a covenant with the patriarch, who is now 75 years old. If Abraham will follow the commandments of God, then he, God, in his turn, will make the descendants of Abraham his chosen people and place them under his protection. We must note here that God does not say there shall be better, namely that they shall exist as a separate and distinct entity and be his people. How this is to be brought about is not revealed exactly by God at this time. He stipulates only one commandment and makes only one promise. The commandment is that all the males of the chosen people must be circumcised on the 8th day after birth, or if converted into the faith, then circumcised upon their conversion. The promise is the land of Canaan. Did this really happen? Jews' views vary all the way from the fundamentalist position of a literal acceptance of every word to the rejection of every word by the skeptics. We say it could have happened, but in a slightly different way. If we view this encounter through the lens of modern psychoanalysis, it might come understandable in more modern terms. Psychiatrists are familiar with a psychological phenomenon known as projection. Let us say that an individual is obsessed by a thought, which, because it's painful or forbidden, he does not want to acknowledge as his own. On the other hand, he can't give it up. He wants the thought, but he doesn't want to own it. He longs for it unconsciously, but wants to reject it on a conscious level. His mind, therefore, resorts to an unconscious trick. He projects the thought onto someone else and then convinces himself that the other person suggested the thought to him or accused him of it. These methods of hearing and perceiving, such projected methods, are known as auditory or visual hallucinations. That's hearing voices or seeing things that are not there for the rest of us. People who have such hallucinations are not necessarily neurotic or psychotic. They can be very intense or totally inspired people. From a psychoanalytical viewpoint, therefore, it would be that Abraham himself conceived the idea of a covenant with an almighty father figure, represented by El Shaddai, and projected onto this father figure his own wish to safeguard his children, his children's children for future generations. From a historical viewpoint, it makes no difference whether it was Abraham who projected the experience onto an imaginary El Shaddai, or a real El Shaddai who proposed it to Abraham. The fact remains that after 4,000 years, the idea of a covenant and the Jews and God, now known as Jehovah after the time of Moses, is still alive and mentioned daily in prayers in synagogues and some churches all over the world. Although many aspects of Jews and Judaism have been changed and modified during their subsequent 4,000-year history, this idea of the covenant is central and has remained constant. This in turn gave rise to a will to survive as Jews, which has been a driving force in Jewish life and Judaism. Without it, there can be no Judaism and no Jews. Once this concept of the covenant disappears, then the Jew, through lack of his inner compulsion, no longer wishes to retain his identity as a Jew, and then nothing stands between him and assimilation, between him and his final disappearance. The methods whereby this wish has been perpetuated have changed through the ages, but the aim has not. Jewish history is a succession of ideas designed to perpetuate this idea of the covenant. And he quotes here from the Bible, "How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, and your dwellings, O Israel," says the pagan priest in the book of Numbers. This, of course, is poetic license, for nomadic life breeds neither art nor culture. For 400 years, Abraham and his descendants wandered about as nomads in the land of Canaan without a country of their own or a stable form of government. They practiced their rite of circumcision, and although they were often esteemed by their neighbours, they were equally often regarded as the most strange people, perhaps even a little crazy, worshipping a god you couldn't see. The Decalogue, the Ten Commandments of Moses, with its prohibition against other gods, didn't come into being until 400 years after this nomadic period. The book of Genesis abounds with examples of idols being part of the household goods of the patriarchs. Three things, however, kept the Jews together during the first centuries of their existence: the ideas which Abraham had conceived, namely that the Jews had one and exclusive God, the rite of circumcision, and the prohibition of human sacrifice, so movingly told in the story of the binding of Isaac, Genesis chapter 22. Once the Jews accepted the idea of monotheism, the idea that there's only one God, they began to behave in a special way without consciously knowing they were doing it. This change in behavior was first imperceptible, but it became even more noticeable, setting them further and further apart from the others, because one has to treat an invisible God differently than a visible one. The Jews developed a ritual distinctly different from that of the surrounding pagans. Because Jehovah is immortal, he never dies. And because he never dies, he never has to be resurrected. So the Jews dispensed with the resurrection rites of the pagans. Because there is but one God, there can be no mythological wars between the gods, and so the Jews dispense with the entire pagan hierarchies of gods and the wars between them. Because Jehovah is motivated by spirituality, he doesn't need a sex life. Thus the Jews did away with fertility rites. The example here is almost, because what Diamond is doing is he's painting a very biblical picture. And the biblical picture is very often a perfect world. The example being set by Jehovah is that of being completely withdrawn from sexuality. It led to a curbing of licentious impulses through a strong inner discipline by the Jews rather than through fear of laws. Compare the path sexuality took in Jewish life with the path in the Greek civilization. The Greek gods themselves set the pattern for this. Unbridled lust and perversion, which finally weakened the moral fibre of the people. Whereas the Jews, even when they later came into contact with the Greeks, refused to indulge in the Greek sexual license. The Jews also avoided the path of total sexual abstinence later taken by the Christian Church. They steered a course between sexual excess and continence, following to the letter the Lord's commandment to have many children. In their zeal to follow this injunction literally, it's understandable if some erred a little on the side of liberality. I would just make the point that according to the Jews, there are 613 commandments scattered around the Hebrew Bible, which we call the Old Testament. The first one you find in Genesis, given to Adam and Eve: go forth and multiply, replenish the earth. In Jewish thinking, that is also the first in importance. And what Diamond says, to go back to him, is that many a pagan mistress disguised as a handmaiden dwelt in the tents of these patriarchs, who beget progeny in abundance at an age when modern man settles down to collect his pension. The nomadic life agreed with the patriarchs, for all, according to the Bible, lived over 100 years. By the time Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat 12 sons, including Joseph, 400 years of Jewish history had slipped by. Then a famine swept the lands northeast of Egypt, and hungry people from many lands including the Hebrews, drifted towards the Nile Delta towards Egypt in search of food. History records they were warmly welcomed in Egypt. It was under the leadership of Joseph that the famine-stricken Hebrews emigrated from Canaan to Egypt. The book of Genesis tells the fascinating story of how Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt. He became a favorite of Pharaoh, rose to viceroy, and with the Pharaoh's permission invited his family to settle there. They tended flocks peacefully until a new Pharaoh arose who was not so kindly disposed to them and had them enslaved. Except for the Bible, no source we know of makes a special mention of this Jewish sojourn and subsequent captivity in Egypt. But the busy spade of the archaeologists has turned up convincing backup evidence that these events did take place. One interesting thing there is one of the mummies they found in Egypt is of a viceroy whose Egyptian name is Yuza, Y-U-Z-A. And by the look of him, he doesn't look like an Egyptian, and he wears his beard differently. You can even see that on the mummy today. The question is, has this got anything to do with the biblical Joseph, bearing in mind that the names are similar? Short answer is, we don't know, but it's intriguing. From the ingathering of the Jews into Egypt in the 16th century BC until the outflowing of the Jews under Moses, probably in the 12th century, there is a 400-year silence. The Bible encompasses these fateful 4 centuries in a few sentences. This raises many perplexing questions. What portion of this period did the Jews live in freedom? What portion in slavery? What religion did they practice? What language did they speak? Was there intermarriage? How did they maintain Judaism as slaves? Who were their leaders before Moses? These are all unknowns. The Bible is silent. Not all the Jews left Canaan to go into Egypt with Joseph. Many remained behind, surviving the famine and keeping their covenant. This remnant of Jews, still known as Hebrews, remained free men while their brothers were enslaved in Egypt. The enslavement of the Jews in Egypt was a fulfillment of prophecy made by El Shaddai to Abraham 4 centuries earlier, perhaps. For it's written, Genesis 15, 13 and 14. Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in the land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve I will judge, and afterwards they will come out with great substance. Or is this prophecy an interpolation by later authors who wrote through hindsight of history, a great fusion to take place in Canaan when Moses leads the Israelites, as they're now called, out of Egypt into the land of Canaan to reunite them with the remnants of the Hebrews who'd stayed behind. Meanwhile, the Hebrews, Israelites or later Jews, are slaves in Egypt. What will happen to Abraham's grand illusion that his seed will inherit the earth? Was it a delusion? Was it a prophecy to be taken up by men appointed by God and fulfilled at a later date? That sets the stage for the foundation of the Jewish experience. I've quoted Diamond at some length because I think he's quite useful. We now need to parachute forward, and I'll just take a few steps. You see, the Bible, as I said, is a bit in isolation. It tells this wonderful story in the book of Joshua about the conquest of Jericho, the trumpets and stamping round 7 times. We all know the story from Sunday school. Jericho is one of the oldest inhabited places on that part of the world. If you go there, you can see it. But did it actually happen that it was destroyed? It was destroyed several times by earthquakes, but we can't tie one in with the story in the Bible. It's just not there. And what actually happened in history was a bit different to the way the Bible tells it, in the sense that there was a huge constant conflict going on between the paganism, the Baal worship. Baal means Lord, and he's usually a corn fertility god, very similar to what we find in modern paganism. And those people that were worshipping the invisible God Jehovah. There was a constant war went on. Not an ideological war, not necessarily a physical one. Because the Canaanites were actually kindred of the Israelites. They're just the ones who had been there all along. So they were much closer than the Bible would have you believe. Because one of the things with the Bible is it's very much about the exclusiveness of the Jewish people. It's an us and them type of thing. So the next big thing that happens is you get a period of tremendous instability through the period of the Judges. And then the people of God, who up until that time had a very sort of, it's what Diamond refers to as the portable God. In other words, his shrine was a thing called the tabernacle, which could be carried about, dismantled and carried about from place to place. And Diamond calls it the portable God, because not only was Jehovah, as he became after Moses, the king of Israel, he was the God of Israel too, but totally invisible. And some of them believed in him and some of them didn't. And it got so bad, they made a promise when they left Egypt that they would have a Passover festival, which is the last of the 10 plagues, when the firstborn, including the son of Pharaoh, were all slain by this mysterious being called the angel of the Lord, who might have been God himself, or might not. They said and promised solemnly by a new covenant under Moses that they would keep a festival to remember it forever. And when they got to Israel, 2 or 3 generations on, they forgot all about it and joined in the usual pagan celebrations. And it's a matter of record that the Passover wasn't celebrated for 400 years until King Josiah reinstituted it. He was one of the good kings who wanted to do what the law of Moses wanted people to do. But before that, 2 other interesting things happened. The first thing was the Jewish nation as a whole went pagan. They said, give us a king. We want a human king. And eventually it was agreed through the prophets, you'll find this in the book of the Kings, that there should be a king. But that was a weakening of the way God had planned it. God made a concession according to the Jews. And King Saul became the first king of Israel. The king was a pagan thing. It was an intermediary between God and his people. The second thing they said was, give us a stone temple. God needs a house. He lived in a tent for thousands of years and was quite happy about it. So eventually, initially they thought it was going to be King David. But King David ended up with blood on his hands and was deemed to be unworthy for murdering a general so that he could go to bed with his wife. And you'll find that listed as well. And he murdered him by making him lead the armies into war, knowing it was a sentence of certain death. But because it was premeditated, God wasn't happy. So it was Solomon who was the person who built the famous temple. If it isn't, as Blavatsky strongly suggests, an allegory for the whole thing. She wonders if it ever existed. Because the marvelous thing is you could read a lot of things, including the whole book of Exodus, as a total allegory. Yes, it has meaning. You move from the animalistic, animal-headed gods of Egypt all the way through to this wonderful being who is a perfected human being, styled the high priest. It's all designed in the book of Exodus, and you can work it out in line completely with the later Kabbalistic principles. And it's been done. I've given lectures on it, there are books on it. I'm not going to go into that here. So we move forward. You've got, and I've covered some of this already, you've got a period of kings, a split kingdom, northern kingdom and southern kingdom. Eventually, both these kingdoms are wiped out because they're disobedient to the rules that were laid down by Moses. And eventually, again, the temple is rebuilt and the Jews come back. Now, there's another thing that's interesting, which is the question of the 10 lost tribes, the northern tribes, because originally there were 12 tribes. We know that the kingdom of Judah was made up of mostly 2 tribes, some of the tribe of Benjamin, but mostly the tribe of Judah. Well, what happened to the rest of them? Well, according to the Bible and according to legend, they were carried off northwards and disappeared. In actual fact, the archaeology and genetics tends to think that they did the obvious and moved south quick, so that the majority of the Jewish people all gathered around the city of Jerusalem. That's the obvious thing to do. And if you check genetics, that's what they think happened. But the Bible doesn't say that. And then what's interesting is you've got to think about this whole business about animal sacrifice. Because like the rest of the pagan world, the center of the temple ritual was sacrificing animals according to an elaborate system of rules in the book of the priesthood rules, which we call Leviticus, one of the 5 books of Moses. And this went on for hundreds of years, up until the time of Christ. 2 things you've got to remember. One is that from the time of Abraham, most of their money, until the time of the Greeks, had 4 legs and walked about. And so if you wanted to give God something of value, it was usually a living animal. And they had elaborate rules. It could be a turtle dove if you were very poor, up to a bullock if you were a little bit wealthier. And they had elaborate ritual meals and all sorts of things going on in the temple. In that sense, they were only slightly different to the majority of the known world. Versions of animal sacrifice was commonplace in temples throughout the world from early times all the way through to the Roman period. In fact, one of the problems they had in the New Testament was, and this is mentioned by Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians, it was almost impossible to buy meat in the Roman world if there was a Roman equivalent of Tesco's, for example, that hadn't actually come out of one of these pagan temples. And Paul's point is, we don't pay any attention or pay any heed at all to these pagan gods. So are we or aren't we allowed to eat meat? Interesting question. But for the Jews, they had their own rules, and as long as they followed them, they were all right. The next thing I want to look at is the question of commandments, and I've moved forward now into the religion of Judaism, which actually is what the ancient Hebrew religion of sacrifice transformed itself into when the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Incidentally, on the very same day in the calendar as Solomon's was by the Babylonians, which festival they kept last Sunday. And the rabbis, who were, it means teacher, and they were the religious leaders of the scattered Jews all over the world. Because they hadn't got a temple, but they still had the scriptures, and so they reinvented a scriptural religion, and they reinterpreted things. We all know the 10 Commandments, which come from Moses, and there's 2 versions of them. But the later rabbis came up with 7 things they thought of as universal for all peoples. By contrast, the 10 Commandments were basically a tribal thing. What it meant was, you won't do this, but it doesn't really matter too much if the others do. But the later rabbis said, no, here are 7 things that are central to being human and should apply to everybody. Don't murder, don't steal, don't worship false gods, don't be sexually immoral, don't eat the limb of an animal before it's been killed, don't curse God, and set up a system of courts and a system of justice. These are the central principles called mitzvot in Hebrew that serve as a foundation for all the other mitzvot of Jewish thinking. According to Jewish tradition, there are 603 more, that making 613 altogether. And then he took the book I'm using talks about 613 habits of highly effective people. In the 3rd century AD, Rabbi Shmuel taught that God gave 613 commandments, also called Taryag Mitzvot, in the Torah. That's the 5 books of Moses. He divided them into 248 positive commandments, thou shalt, and 365 negative commandments, thou shalt not. The number 248 was believed to correspond to the number of organs and sinews in the body. The number 365 corresponded to the number of days in the solar year. Some examples of the positive ones are believe in God, love God, study and teach the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, build a sanctuary for God, participate at the synagogue, which is the modern version of the sanctuary, say the blessing after meals, spiritually cleanse yourself, ritually cleanse yourself in a ritual bath, called a mikvah. Leave gleanings for the poor. They used to have a custom in Israel of never harvesting the corners of fields so that the poor could always gather grain. Tithe to the poor. Rest on the Sabbath. Eat matzvah, which is the unleavened bread during the Passover season. Fast on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, festival in September, October, the Day of Atonement. Give charity. And he gives some examples of some negative ones. Don't believe any other God but God. Don't worship idols. Don't get tattoos or decorative scars. Don't enter the sanctuary intoxicated. Don't delay payment of vows and promises. Don't eat an unclean animal. Don't eat or drink blood. Don't eat leavened products on the Passover. That's things with yeast. Don't fail to give to charity. Don't convict someone on the testimony of a single witness. Of the 613 commandments, over 200 of them can't be observed because they require an ancient temple. As we said, the temple ritual ceased in AD 70 in the Christian era. Additionally, some people say that 26 of the commandments mean that you need to live in Israel, like the one about leaving a portion of the field unharvested so there's food left for the poor. These commandments are scattered all over the Bible, so different rabbis will include different mitzvah in their lists and order them differently. There's an old joke that says, if you ask 5 different rabbis to explain a point of law, you'll end up with 6 answers. One important legal rabbi was Maimonides, 12th century, who wrote a book of commandments. And then there was another one called Sheikh Chaim, who wrote the concise book of commandments. They all number the commandments differently, but they more or less say the same thing. They were codified in a book called The Arranged Table by Joseph Caro in the 16th century, which still serves as a basic authority for matters of traditional practice. I should say here that the other thing that happened over the centuries was that as the Jews found themselves outside Israel, they would say to each other, if I was in Israel, this is what the Bible tells me to do, but I know I'm not, so what do I do about it? And so a wider and wider group of interpretations and commissions grew up, which became known as the Talmud, which was the commentaries on the Bible saying, if you're stuck in this position, here's what you do. Because they still wanted to be Jews, and they still wanted to be obedient, or religious observant ones. But what do you do? For example, if you are an Orthodox Jew and you want to buy some new crockery, because eating of meals plays a very important part in Jewish life and also Jewish religious ritual nowadays, you're supposed to take the crockery and give it a ceremonial dip in the mitzvah. What do you do if you haven't got a special ritual bath that's been blessed by a rabbi to do it in? And the other thing is that it must contain running water. And the rabbis came up with a solution. If you haven't got a ritual bath, take it to the seaside and dip it in the sea. It'll do. And the majority of Jews are able to dip it in the sea or dip it in a river if necessary. to deal with the commandment. I saw a wonderful film about the Orthodox rabbi in Dublin taking his new crockery out to the seaside in order to keep it ritually pure, so he was obedient. Good luck to it. So they've got a very complex view of ritual practice. A bit about women and these commandments, the mitzvot. All the negative commandments maintain to both men and women, but women are exempted from some of the positive time-specific commandments because of the demands of child rearing and taking care of the home. So you've got, in Orthodox terms, a division between the home as the sacred place where that the women inhabit, and the synagogue where a group of 10 men will go to perform religious services as a sort of mimicking of what happened to the priests in the temple. For instance, traditionally, women aren't required to wear the talit, the prayer shawl, or attend the daily synagogue worship meetings. Although no specific injunction forbids them, more traditional communities tend not to, but these days you quite often see the more modernized liberal communities, as we call them, carrying out these practices. There's greater equality among Jewish women now than there used to be, so quite often they behave just the same as the men do. That comes from Judaism for Dummies, second edition, by Ted Falcon and David Plater. The other thing I need to talk about, I think, is the Jewish dietary laws, because this is the most common one. What's with this kosher thing is the way they describe it. It's become part of common language, at least in America. And in English, it means something that's allowed, legal, or proper. However, in Judaism, kosher almost exclusively relates to food, what Jews are and are not allowed to eat. The Jewish dietary laws are technically called kashrut, and they're so complicated that whole volumes have been written about them. This again you can find in a chapter in the book of Leviticus. To simplify the origin of them, what you find is the animals that tended to dwell in the desert are clean. The animals that didn't dwell in the desert are not. So again, in a way, you've got the Jews as a group of people hankering back to the marvelous time when the Abraham and Moses and all that lot were all wandering around as nomads. Apart from the fact that in Moses' time, if you read the book of Exodus in particular, they spent all the time moaning about not being in Egypt. But now they're hankering back after the desert by declaring that most of the desert animals are clean. So the basic rules are these. An animal with cloven hooves that chews its cud is kosher. This includes cattle, sheep, goats, and deer. Other mammals like pigs, camels, and hares aren't kosher, technically called tarif, from the Hebrew word meaning torn. Not only are they not to be eaten, but no products which derive from them are kosher. Certain procedures must also be followed to ensure humane slaughter. For example, an animal's throat must be cut by a trained ritual slaughterer using the single slice of an extremely sharp knife without a nick in it. Certain parts of the animals aren't kosher, such as the sciatic nerve in the hindquarters. This is an interesting one because it has reference to the story in Genesis of Jacob wrestling with an angel who in Jewish tradition was said to be a bad angel, and the angel grabbed Jacob on the thigh, and that meant that the sciatic nerve became suspect. Unfortunately, not only are these parts difficult to remove, they also include some choicest cuts. You won't find kosher filet mignon, rump or sirloin steaks, leg of lamb, etc., etc. Animals that are diseased or have physically flawed organs are also unclean. When the lungs of animals are examined for irregularities and none are found, the animal is considered glut or smooth. If there's a question about the quality of the meat, even if it proves to be just fine kosher, it may not be glut kosher. Seafood is kosher as long as it has fins and scales. Shellfish like lobsters, oysters, shrimps, octopus, clam, and crabs are out. Some fish like swordfish and sturgeon have scales that are questionable, and they're usually considered out, unclean. Domesticated fowl, chicken, turkey, quail, hens, doves, geese, duck, and pheasant are kosher. But all birds of prey, like eagles and hawks, are forbidden. All reptiles, insects, and amphibians are forbidden. Note that some food additives and colorings are made from insects, so these items are prohibited too. There are some exceptions. Shellac, which comes from the lac bug and is used to make many foods shiny, is kosher because they consider it more like a rock than a food. But that again comes from Judaism for dummies. The other thing that I want to mention briefly is the Jewish festivals, the feasts, because they have their own calendar and they keep their own rituals. Broadly, these come within three groups. There's the high holy days, the agricultural festivals, and the others. There's two new years in the Jewish world. They begin one year, the religious year, with the new moon on the month of Nisan, which is March, April, around the equinox. Easter time to us, near enough, except their way of calculating Easter isn't exactly the same as ours, but that's where the parallel is. And that's the celebration of Exodus, when the Lord passed over the Jewish houses with blood on the lintels. Then 50 days later, you get Shavuot, which is the festival known as Pentecost in Greek, which was the main wheat harvest festival. And that's usually around late May or June, depending on when the moon immediately after the vernal equinox happens to fall. They count from the new moon, and Passover is always on the 14th day. The next one that we come to is the one that we've just celebrated, Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, and that's always in July or August. That's the celebration of when the temple was desecrated, both of them, and that's a tremendous day of mourning. The next one you get, usually in September, the double feast with 11 days between them of Rosh Hashanah and then Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah is when the world was said to be created, known as the Feast of Trumpets. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, when the scapegoat used to be, the sins would be put on the goat's head, and the goat was either originally slaughtered or then set free in the wilderness to purify the people. Shortly after that, you get Sukkot, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, when they move outside for their meals in a manufactured woven booth. It commemorates them living in the desert for 40 years. Then, late November, early December, you get Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights. It's a late one because it commemorates in the Greek period the time when the temple was desecrated by Antiochus Epiphanes, and they could only find, the priests could only find enough oil to light the candles for one day, because they didn't use candles, they used what was basically a 7-branched oil lamp. And by a miracle, the oil, one day's supply of oil, lasted the 8 days that it took them to tidy up the temple and find some more oil. And that was usually a festival where children were given money. They light an 8-branched candlestick menorah to celebrate the 8 days and put it in their window. The very modern one, usually in the middle of January, is the celebration of the Shoah, which is the solemn commemoration of the Holocaust, which is a modern one in Israel. Finally, in the year, before we get to the new year of Passover again, you get Purim, usually in March. That's the story of Esther. And the interesting thing about that is that there was a man called Haram, the book tells us, that wanted to exterminate all the Jews. And this happened in the Persian period, when the Queen of Persia was Esther. And she managed to persuade the king, and it was Haran, the wicked man, who was the one that was punished, and the Jews survived. That's a wild party festival for children. They read the book of Esther, which is quite short, on the feast day. And every time Haran's name is mentioned, the children have all got football rattles and whistles and such like things. And they make a deafening noise. And so everybody's dressed up in costumes. It's a great celebration. And that brings the wheel of the year around back to Passover again, which is a week's worth of fasting, remembering the Exodus, as we said. That's only a very brief summary of the Jewish religion and way of life, but I hope it's given you a flavour for it. In conclusion, there's one interesting, fairly modern thing. You can always identify the people among the Jews who are literally the descendants of Aaron the first high priest, because they have the name Cohen, meaning priest. And there was an interesting study done fairly recently in America where they did some genetics on quite a sizable group of people who were all Jewish Cohens. And the thing that was surprising was that it definitely looked genetically as if they were all descended from one man. And that's not what the scientists were expecting. So how much of the Bible is wonderful, fancy teaching stories, and how much of it is literally true, it remains an interesting question. I hope that's given you some insight into what we're talking about when we think about the Jews and their ways of doing things. I'm going to turn off the recording now and then invite you to unmute yourselves.